Old weapons, raging storms, and raw wilderness, sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. From an antique rifle felling America's largest Kodiak to a moose nearly hurling hunters off a Yukon cliff. From a black bear ripping through a tent to a grizzly killing in 2 brutal minutes. From lightning turning an elk hunt into chaos to a ridge stampede of pronghorn threatening a fatal fall, these stories prove that nature never plays fair. Watch till the end, because survival is always measured in seconds. September 2017 brought storms and heavy fog to the wild coastlines of Kodiak Island, where 2 hunters made their way across the tidal flats, their boots sinking into the soft mud with each step. Eli Warren gripped an old .45, 70 lever-action rifle, its steel scarred by years of use, its wooden stock polished smooth from the hands of generations. Beside him walked Caleb Brooks, scanning the mist with wide eyes, the crashing surf and drumming rain drowning out most sounds. The men were not after any ordinary quarry, but a legendary bear said to be the largest in living memory. A beast that dwarfed others in size and strength. The weather made the task even more dangerous. Rain poured sideways, driven by wind, while clouds hung low, cutting visibility to only a few yards. Every shadow in the gray haze seemed alive. Every crash of water against rock echoed like footsteps. They knew such conditions could conceal movement until it was too late. Yet they pressed on, their hearts heavy with anticipation. From the thick alder thickets came the sudden explosion of power. The giant predator burst into the open, its frame immense, its roar shaking the ground. At nearly 1,700 pounds, it looked more like a force of nature than flesh and blood. Its eyes locked instantly on Caleb, who froze in the mud, stunned by the sight of the charging monster. The earth quaked beneath its charge, claws tearing through the sodden earth as it closed the distance with terrifying speed. Eli reacted by instinct, raising the antique weapon and pulling the trigger. The heavy 405-grain slug slammed into the shoulder of the oncoming giant, mud spraying high as the sound of the shot echoed through the valley. Yet the blow hardly slowed it. The predator roared and barreled forward, jaws snapping, the gap shrinking with each furious stride. Caleb stumbled backward, arms flailing as he slipped in the muck, the massive form looming above him. Eli threw the lever down, chambering another round, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. He fired again, this time striking deep into the chest. The impact sent a shudder through the animal, blood spraying into the rain, yet it still pressed forward, strength defying belief. The hunters braced for impact as the beast reached its final strides, jaws gnashing only feet from its target. Then, with a deafening roar that rolled across the tidal flats, it faltered. Its legs buckled, the weight of its massive body crashing into the mud and water. The tide lapped at its fallen form as the hunters stood shaking, soaked and bruised, their ears still ringing from the blasts. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm, the body of the predator lying still at last. The men looked at one another, realizing they had faced not just a hunt, but a battle for their very lives. An ancient weapon wielded with calm under pressure had brought down a living legend in the most unforgiving of places. The storm raged on as the 2 men stood in the sucking mud, staring at the massive shape sprawled across the tidal flats. The giant had fallen only yards from where Caleb had slipped, its jaws parted in a final frozen snarl. The tide crept forward with each minute, waves curling against the motionless bulk, streaks of crimson swirling into the gray water. Eli tightened his grip on the lever action, the barrel still warm, his chest heaving as the reality of what had just unfolded sank deeper into his mind. Caution held them still for long moments. Even in death, the bear looked unstoppable, its body dwarfing theirs, its claws half buried in the churned earth where it had charged. When they finally approached, the sheer scale of the animal became clear. Its back rose taller than either of them, its head broad enough to crush a man's chest in one snap. Rain fell hard across its matted fur, and the size of the paw prints left in the flats stretched wider than their boots. Caleb limped forward, shaken and pale, pointing at the torn earth where the first shot had landed. The wound was massive, yet the beast had pressed forward as though untouched, proof of the raw power contained in its enormous frame. The second strike to the chest had pierced deep, the spray of blood still visible along the mud and reeds. And yet even that had not stopped its momentum until the very end. They worked together to drag their scattered packs closer, pulling tarps free and marking the site. Their bodies trembled with exhaustion, adrenaline draining to leave behind bone-deep fatigue. Each movement reminded them how close they had been to death, the roar of the animal echoing in their minds like thunder. Neither spoke, but the silence carried the weight of everything they felt: relief, awe, and sorrow for the life that had been ended. Word of their survival and the fallen beast spread quickly once they returned to the nearest settlement. Guides and locals gathered, eager to see the proof of the encounter. Many had heard rumors of the monster that roamed the island, its massive tracks found along rivers and its shadow spotted in the fog. Now it lay measured and documented, its size dwarfing records of others before it. Authorities confirmed it as the largest Kodiak ever brought down in American history, its sheer mass leaving even the most seasoned hunters speechless. Eli's rifle, battered and old, became the focus of many conversations. Passed down from his grandfather, it had survived storms, hunts, and generations of use, and now it had stopped a beast that seemed unstoppable. To Eli, the rifle was more than steel and wood. It was a bond to his family, to the lessons of patience, calm, and respect for the land. That bond had carried him through the storm and the charge, giving him the strength to act when seconds meant life or death. For weeks afterward, Eli and Caleb replayed the event in their minds, hearing the thunder of paws, feeling the tremor of the earth beneath them, and remembering how close they had come to being torn apart. It was a reminder carved into their bones that Kodiak Island was not just wild country, but a place where legends walked, and where only courage and steady hands could tip the balance between survival and tragedy. In late September 2025, the Yukon's wild ridges above the frozen Kluane River were wrapped in heavy fog, every ledge and stone slick with frost. Hunters Ethan McLeod and Claire Tremblay moved carefully along the narrow path, rifles strapped tight and eyes scanning the mist for signs of rutting bull moose. The air was sharp, filled with the sounds of rushing water below and the crack of loose rocks shifting underfoot. Each step felt like it carried the weight of risk, for one slip could send them tumbling into the icy depths. Out of the thick gray haze, a sudden shape materialized. A colossal bull moose, its massive antlers stretching wider than a man's arms could span, burst forward with terrifying speed. Its breath steamed in the cold as it thundered down the slope, hooves striking stone with the weight of a charging giant. The hunters froze for a split second, the sheer size of the animal overwhelming in the confined space of the cliffside. Ethan lifted his .338 Win Mag and squeezed the trigger, the blast echoing against the walls of the canyon. The bullet struck but ricocheted off a jagged boulder, shattering rock shards into the air without slowing the beast. The moose lowered its antlers, eyes wild with fury, and barreled closer. Claire had no time to react before the animal crashed into her with bone-shaking force, sending her sliding toward the cliff edge. Her boots scraped helplessly against the ice-slick stone, the river a deadly blur far below. Heart racing, Ethan lunged forward and caught her arm just as she teetered on the brink. His grip strained against the pull of gravity as the moose turned again, hooves scraping against the rocks, preparing for another charge. The ridge seemed to shrink beneath them, every move a battle between survival and disaster. Ethan swung his rifle up once more, aiming as the beast lunged. The crack of the shot tore through the fog, and this time the bullet drove deep into the animal's chest. The bull staggered, its hooves slipping against the icy slope. With a final roar of breath, it stumbled into the ravine, crashing down into the snow and rocks below. The echo of its fall rumbled through the canyon until only silence remained, broken only by the ragged breaths of the two hunters clinging to the ridge. Bruised and scraped, their gear scattered across the frost, Ethan and Claire leaned against the stone, their bodies still trembling. The fog wrapped around them like a shroud, the memory of the charge fresh in their minds. What had begun as a careful stalk for game had turned into a fight for survival on the unforgiving cliffside, proving how quickly the wilderness could transform from calm to chaos in a heartbeat. The fog hung heavy as the echoes of the fallen bull faded into the valley. Ethan and Claire remained pressed against the cold rock, their bodies shaking from both exhaustion and shock. The silence after the chaos felt unreal, every breath loud in their ears. Claire's jacket was torn from the violent impact. Her arms scraped raw where the stone had cut her skin. Ethan's hands still burned from gripping her with all his strength, the strain of pulling her back from the brink leaving his muscles weak. The path behind them was littered with fragments of shattered stone and gear that had been scattered during the struggle. A broken strap dangled from Ethan's pack, and the ice held streaks of blood where Claire had been shoved by the charging moose. Below in the ravine, the massive body of the bull lay twisted, steam rising faintly from its wounds as the cold swallowed it. Its great antlers were wedged against boulders, a silent reminder of how close death had come for them both. For several minutes, neither of them moved, their minds replaying the moment when the moose had first exploded from the mist. The image of its antlers glinting through the fog remained burned into their memory, a warning of how quickly the wilderness could unleash its fury. Finally, Ethan steadied himself and helped Claire back to firmer ground along the ridge. Every step felt fragile, the slick stone reminding them that one mistake could still be their undoing. They paused at a small outcrop, the first place wide enough to rest without fear of slipping into the river far below. There, Ethan tightened a bandage around Claire's arm while she tried to catch her breath. The bitter wind bit through their layered clothes, but the chill seemed minor compared to the shock of what they had endured. Both hunters knew that if his second shot had missed, the outcome would have been very different. When the fog began to thin, they carefully made their way down the slope toward the ravine. Retrieving the animal was slow and dangerous, but they needed proof of the kill and the antlers as a sign of the battle they had survived. The bull's body was immense, its sheer size daunting even in death. Claire rested her hand against the frozen hide, her expression a mixture of awe and relief. It was not triumph they felt, but respect for a creature whose raw strength had nearly ended their lives. By the time they reached camp, word of the close encounter had already spread among the guides. Fellow hunters listened in stunned silence as Ethan and Claire described the ridge, the charge, and the desperate struggle. The guides reminded everyone that cliffs and fog magnify danger, stripping hunters of space and time to react. That night, as the cold deepened, the two sat by the fire in quiet reflection. Survival had been won by inches, and the wild had carved a memory that would never leave them. In late July 2024, the deep forests of coastal Oregon were heavy with damp air, the ground soft from summer rains. Hunters Connor Hayes and Maya Sinclair had set up camp along a narrow clearing, their tent pitched close to a berry thicket where signs of wildlife were fresh. Deer tracks marked the mud, but they both knew the thickets also drew black bears, which were searching for food. Still, the pair felt prepared. Connor had kept his .30.06 rifle within reach, while Maya wore a hunting knife strapped across her chest. Both trusted their gear and training to keep them safe through the night. The hours passed quietly as the forest darkened. Distant owls called through the trees and the hum of insects filled the night. The hunters lay in their tent, their gear arranged carefully beside them, unaware that a predator was already closing in. Drawn by the smell of food scraps and human scent, a massive black bear weighing nearly 350 pounds prowled silently toward the camp. Its paws crunched faintly on the underbrush, and then, without warning, it lunged straight into the canvas shelter. The tent collapsed in chaos, fabric ripping apart as claws slashed downward. Connor cried out as jagged claws raked across his side, tearing through his shirt and leaving burning wounds. Maya scrambled for the rifle, but the predator swiped at her too, slashing her shoulder and knocking her backward. The sound of tearing canvas and heavy growls filled the clearing. Connor grabbed the rifle and managed to fire 2 quick shots into the ground beside the animal. The sound cracked through the forest, staggering the beast but not driving it away. Snarling, the bear lunged again, smashing into their gear and scattering packs, boots, and cooking pots across the clearing. Maya, her hand slick with blood from her shoulder, pulled the knife from its sheath and jabbed as the animal came close. The blade struck fur and muscle, making the beast reel for a moment. Connor shoved their backpacks between himself and the predator, using them as a weak barrier. Every second felt like the end as the bear lunged and backed off, furious and relentless. The air inside the ruined tent grew thick with fear and the pungent sense of sweat, blood, and the musky odor of the predator. Connor's arms trembled as he braced himself with the rifle, while Maya pressed forward with the knife, both desperate to create space between themselves and the massive animal. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the predator pulled back, staggering slightly from the combined blows and noise. Its growls echoed in the darkness as it retreated into the trees, leaving the hunters shaken, bruised, and bleeding among the ruins of their camp. The night air was silent again, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on their minds. Survival had been measured in seconds, and both knew the fight had been far too close. The silence after the chaos felt heavy as Connor and Maya remained crouched in the wreckage of their tent, listening for any sign of the predator's return. The forest, once full of night sounds, now seemed still as if holding its breath. Connor pressed his hand against the bleeding cuts along his side, his shirt soaked and sticking to his skin. Maya's shoulder throbbed, each movement sending sharp pain down her arm. Both were alive, but the marks on their bodies and the shredded remains of their camp told a story of how close death had come. The ground around them was littered with torn gear and broken supplies. The canvas lay in strips across the dirt, boots and food scattered across the thicket. Claw marks slashed through their packs, leaving holes where once they held the tools that had kept them prepared. The smell of gunpowder hung faintly in the air, a reminder of Connor's desperate shots. Each piece of ruined equipment showed how little stood between them and a powerful predator in the dark. They gathered what they could, pulling together knives, first aid kits, and anything still usable. Connor's wounds stung with every movement as Maya tied cloth tightly around his ribs. Blood soaked through the bandage, but at least it slowed the flow. Her own shoulder was wrapped with strips from her torn sleeve, stiffening quickly in the cool night air. Both worked in silence, their focus locked on surviving until daylight. Sleep was impossible. They built a small fire near the edge of the clearing, its glow pushing back the shadows. Sparks crackled as they kept watch, eyes darting to every sound in the trees. Each snap of a branch, each shift of wind across the thicket made their hearts pound, convinced the animal was circling again. Hours dragged by as they sat together, the flames their only shield against the endless dark. When the first light crept across the forest, relief spread through them. The danger had not vanished, but the daylight gave them strength. They began packing what little was left, moving slowly but carefully. The torn tent was abandoned, along with gear ruined beyond use. What they carried now was only what was essential to reach safety. Connor leaned heavily on a walking stick he cut from a branch, each step painful but steady. By midday, they stumbled into a ranger outpost several miles from their camp. The sight of people rushing forward to help broke the weight of the night. Medics cleaned their wounds, stitched the deeper gashes, and gave them water that felt like life itself. As they rested, they recounted the story of the night, their voices still shaking with every detail. Word spread quickly among the rangers and local hunters. The lesson was clear. Food scents, open camps, and dense thickets were all risks that could draw predators closer than anyone expected. For Connor and Maya, the memory of claws tearing through canvas and the weight of the beast pressing forward would never leave. Survival had depended on quick action, steady nerves, and the strength to fight when escape seemed impossible. In late September 2019, the forests of Russia's Amur region were heavy with silence as 4 hunters moved through thick spruce. Igor Petrov, Mikhail Sokolov, and Pavel Ivanov pushed deeper into the undergrowth, their rifles steady and packs weighing heavily on their backs. A short distance away, younger hunter Sergei Volkov positioned himself about 50 yards ahead, crouched low as he scanned for signs of elk. The air was damp, and moss clung to every stone, muffling footsteps while mist curled between the trees. Without warning, the stillness shattered. From the darkness of the pines, a massive Ussuri grizzly burst forward, weighing more than 1,200 pounds, its body a blur of white teeth and muscle. Its charge tore branches from trees and shook the ground beneath the hunter's boots. Igor raised his weapon and fired, the echo cracking through the valley, but the shot struck shallow, only grazing the massive frame. The beast barely slowed, its momentum unstoppable. In seconds, the predator was upon them. It slammed into Igor with crushing force, claws raking through flesh and fabric, tossing him aside like driftwood. Pavel tried to aim, but the bear's paw smashed across his chest, sending him sprawling as his rifle clattered against the roots. The ground shook with every movement as the forest filled with the screams of men and the guttural growls of the enraged beast. Mikhail tried to retreat, his boots slipping on slick moss. He stumbled against a jagged stone, and before he could recover, the predator loomed over him. Its weight pinned him flat, its claws tearing through his torso in a frenzy of power and rage. Blood splattered across the rocks as his cries faded beneath the roar of the animal. Sergei, hidden behind a thicket only yards away, watched in frozen horror. His rifle trembled in his hands, his finger hovering near the trigger, but fear held him locked in place. His breath came in ragged gasps as he saw the carnage unfold in a blur of violence. He wanted to move, to act, but the crushing weight of terror rooted him to the spot. Within 2 minutes, the forest fell eerily quiet again. Igor lay broken on the moss, Pavel sprawled near a splintered tree, and Mikhail was crumpled beneath torn branches. The predator's growls echoed low and steady as it surveyed the ground before finally retreating into the shadowed timber. The devastation it left behind was silent but absolute. Sergei stood pale, his heart hammering in his chest. He clutched his rifle, unsure if he had survived by choice or by luck. The images burned into his mind would never fade. The speed of the charge, the overwhelming strength, and the helpless cries of his companions. Slowly, shaking with every step, he turned away from the scene and began the long retreat toward safety, carrying the weight of horror he would never escape. Sergei's legs carried him forward, though every stride felt heavy, his boots sinking into moss and wet earth. His chest burned with each breath as he forced himself deeper into the trees, away from the clearing where his companions had fallen. Behind him, the forest had returned to an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant groan of wind through branches. Each step sent echoes of what he had just seen racing through his mind, the images of teeth, claws, and broken bodies carved forever into his memory. The young hunter stumbled more than once, catching himself on trunks slick with lichen. His hands shook so violently that he struggled to keep his rifle from clattering to the ground. He knew the predator might still be close, its hunger not fully sated, its rage perhaps not yet gone. The possibility that it could return at any moment kept his heart hammering and his senses raw. By the time he reached the edge of a logging path, Sergei could hardly stand. He dropped to his knees, gasping in the damp air, forcing himself to stay quiet, though his body ached to cry out. Hours passed before he found a patrol camp, his words tumbling out in fragments, his face pale with shock. Guards and trackers rushed back toward the site, moving quickly through the same shadowed terrain that had swallowed his friends. When they arrived, the scene was worse than any of them had prepared for. Supplies were scattered, weapons were broken, and clothing was torn. The ground was soaked and torn apart, the moss stripped down to bare earth where claws had raked. The hunters lay where they had fallen, their rifles useless beside them. Even seasoned men who had faced danger in the wild before stood shaken at the destruction a single beast had left behind in only minutes. The authorities later spoke of how Ussuri grizzlies, especially those of enormous size, could strike with unmatched power. They explained that no matter the preparation, no matter the skill, the balance of strength was always uneven when such a predator chose to unleash its fury. Camps and hunting parties had been warned of the risks, but this attack left no doubt. Nature could overwhelm even the most confident group without warning. For Sergei, survival came with little comfort. In the days after, he replayed the moment he froze, the chance he might have fired and changed something. He carried the weight of guilt alongside grief, believing he should have acted, though the truth was that nothing could have turned the tide. His youth ended in that clearing, replaced by the heavy knowledge of how fragile human strength is when set against the force of the wild. The forest remained as it always had, quiet and indifferent. Yet to Sergei and those who heard his account, it would forever carry the echo of that day. The story was retold in the villages nearby, not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning. It reminded everyone who entered those woods that the land belonged first to the beasts, and that even a few short minutes could decide life or death. In September 2025, the skies above Wyoming's Teton Range were heavy with dark storm clouds, and the sound of thunder rolled through the valleys. Hunters Daniel Carter and Emily Brooks pushed forward along a jagged ridge, their boots sinking into the slick mud as rain poured steadily. They were tracking a massive 6x6 bull elk, its haunting bugle echoing faintly from the canyon below. The fog clung stubbornly to the cliffs, and every step carried the risk of slipping into the steep drop-offs that lined their path. The bull was close, its scent carried by the wind and its heavy form hidden somewhere in the swirling haze. The storm grew harsher, lightning slicing across the sky and lighting the landscape in flashes of white. For a brief second, the fog lifted and the bull appeared like a phantom, its wet antlers shining, eyes glowing in alarm. The sight lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to send adrenaline racing through both hunters. Emily steadied her rifle, aiming through the storm. Her .300 Win Mag roared, the shot echoing off the canyon walls. The bullet struck the bull's shoulder, but instead of dropping, the giant beast let out a wild snort and charged recklessly down the ridge. The ground shook under its weight as it plowed through brush, kicking rocks that tumbled loudly into the stormy depths below. Daniel tried to hold his balance on the soaked trail, but the mud gave way beneath his boots, forcing him dangerously close to the cliff's edge. With quick reflexes, he grabbed a low branch and pulled himself back before the drop. His breath came hard, the storm mixing fear with the rush of the hunt. Ahead, the elk continued, crashing through saplings, leaving broken branches in its wake. The chase pulled them lower down the ridge, where rushing streams of storm water cut across their path. Each crossing risked their footing, the water pulling hard at their legs, but the hunters pressed on, driven by instinct and determination. Lightning lit the bull again as it stumbled, its great body slowing from exhaustion, yet still unwilling to stop. The ridge became a battle between predator and prey, but also between humans and the raw fury of nature itself. Near a flooded creek at the base of the canyon, the elk paused, its heaving breath clouding the cold air. Emily raised her rifle once more, steady despite the storm. A second shot rang out, striking deep, and the bull staggered, finally collapsing into the mud and water. The storm raged above them, but for the hunters the chaos began to quiet. Their bodies ached with bruises, their clothes clung soaked to their skin, and their lungs burned from the chase. Yet in that moment they knew the ridge had tested every ounce of strength they had. The fallen elk lay before them, massive and still, as thunder rolled overhead. Both hunters realized that fate, weather, and terrain had turned the pursuit into a fight for survival, one that neither would forget. The storm did not ease as the two hunters stood near the fallen bull, its body half submerged in the swirling creek. Rain beat down on their shoulders, soaking their gear until it clung heavily to their skin. Lightning cut across the sky once again, throwing brief flashes of white across the canyon walls, and thunder cracked so loud it rattled their bones. The ridge that had nearly claimed them now seemed even more threatening as water poured down the slopes, loosening rocks and sending them crashing into the depths. Daniel knelt beside the animal, his breath visible in the cold, his muscles aching from the chase. The bull was immense, its rack glistening under the sheets of rain, a reminder of the sheer size and strength they had pursued through the storm. Emily stood guard nearby, her rifle ready, her eyes sweeping the fog to ensure no other danger lurked within the shifting shadows. Though the beast had fallen, the land itself felt alive, wild and eager to test them further. Dragging the animal from the creek was impossible in such conditions, so they began the long, grueling process of quartering the elk where it had dropped. Their knives moved slowly, fingers stiff from the cold. Mud mixed with blood beneath their boots, and each sound of rock shifting above them kept their nerves tight. The storm's fury masked every noise, leaving them unsure if they were truly alone on the ridge. Hours passed before the work was complete. Their packs were now heavy with meat, and their bodies were sore from lifting. Each load pressed painfully against Daniel's bruised ribs and Emily's aching shoulders, but leaving anything behind in such wild terrain meant losing the reward of their risk. The ridge that had seemed narrow during the chase now felt even more treacherous with the added weight. Each step tested their balance, their boots sliding in the thick muck. By the time they reached higher ground, the storm had finally begun to weaken. The lightning grew distant, the thunder fading into soft echoes across the range. Fog still clung to the cliffs, but the hunters felt relief as the worst of the storm passed. They stopped to rest beneath a rocky outcrop, dropping their packs to the ground with exhausted groans. The valley below looked quiet once again, but both knew it was not the same silence they had known before the hunt. It carried with it the memory of chaos, of close calls, and of nature's ruthless power. When they finally returned to camp, fellow hunters listened with wide eyes as Daniel and Emily recounted what had happened on the ridge. The story carried warnings of storms that arrive without mercy, of ridges that crumble underfoot, and of animals that fight even when struck hard. Guides later repeated that the Teton Range, though breathtaking, punishes those who underestimate its storms. For Daniel and Emily, the memory of that hunt would never fade. They had taken the bull, but the ridge had nearly taken them too. In late October 2023, the sharp wind cut across the high plains of Wyoming as hunters Logan Reed and Samantha Cole made their way up a jagged ridge. The morning air was heavy with fog that wrapped around the cliffs, making every step uncertain. Loose rock and wet soil crumbled beneath their boots, yet they pressed on, tracking a herd of pronghorn that had wandered close to the ridgeline. The animals stood alert on the open slope, their slender frames and keen eyes scanning for danger. Logan steadied his .270 Win, lining up on a mature buck. His shot cracked through the mist but only grazed the animal. In an instant, the calm shattered. The herd panicked, bursting into motion. Dozens of pronghorn surged across the slope, hooves clattering against stone, their speed turning the ridge into a stampede. The ground itself seemed to break apart under the rush. Rocks tumbled in showers, mud slid away in sheets, and the hunters were caught in the middle of the chaos. Samantha struggled to keep her balance as the herd funneled past, the pounding hooves echoing through the cliffs. A wave of dirt and loose stone gave way beneath her, and she slipped, falling onto one knee as her body slid dangerously close to the edge. Logan lunged forward through the storm of animals, his boots scraping over slick rock. Just as she began to tilt over the side, he grasped her arm, holding tight as the ridge shuddered under the stampede. The rush of pronghorn thundered past them, some leaping across cracks in the stone, others vanishing into the fog below. The herd did not stop until it reached safer ground. When the dust settled, one buck stood alone on a lower ledge, weakened and staggering from exhaustion after its frantic escape. Logan braced himself, aimed again through the haze, and this time his shot was true. The buck collapsed, the echo of the rifle fading quickly into the wide silence of the plains. Breathing hard, the hunters looked around at the broken slope. The ridge bore scars of the stampede, loosened stones, long tracks carved by frantic hooves, and fresh mud scattered across the rocks. Samantha's clothes were streaked with dirt, her legs trembling from the near fall. Logan's hands still shook from the effort of pulling her back. Both stood in silence for a long moment, realizing how thin the line had been between survival and disaster. The hunt had turned into something far more dangerous than either expected. The pronghorn, small compared to other game, had revealed the brutal truth that numbers and speed, when combined with treacherous terrain, could turn even a routine pursuit into a deadly trial. Their hearts pounded in unison as they steadied themselves on the ridge, aware that the land itself had nearly claimed them as surely as the herd might have. The ridge lay quiet again, but the silence only made the aftermath feel heavier. Logan steadied his breathing as he helped Samantha to her feet. Her arms and legs were streaked with mud, her palms scraped raw from where she had grabbed the ground to stop herself from sliding further. The chill of the fog clung to their clothes, and every heartbeat reminded them how close they had been to falling into the canyon below. What had started as a simple stalk for pronghorn had turned into a test of survival against the terrain itself. They moved slowly down the slope toward the lower ledge where the buck had fallen. The rocks were still loose, shifting under each step, and the memory of the stampede made both tread with more care than before. When they reached the animal, they could see the toll of the chase. The buck's body lay sprawled among scattered stones, its hooves cracked from pounding across the hard ridge, its chest still warm from the frantic run. Logan knelt beside it, his rifle laid across his lap, while Samantha scanned the slope above them. Dust still drifted from higher rocks where the herd had passed. The land looked scarred, as if a storm had ripped through and left nothing untouched. They knew that had either of them slipped at the wrong moment, the cliff would have taken them as easily as it had carried down the pronghorn. Collecting the animal was a slow process. The slope gave little space to work, and the fog still pressed around them like a curtain. Logan tied a rope around the antlers while Samantha steadied her footing on a nearby outcrop, holding the other end. Together, they inched the carcass down to a flatter patch of ground where they could dress it more safely. Every movement reminded them of how dangerous the ridge had become when speed and panic had turned the animals into a stampede. As they worked, the weight of the moment sank in deeper. Samantha's clothes were torn, her boots caked with mud, and her body ached from where the stones had struck her. Logan's hands were bruised and swollen from gripping the rope and pulling her back from the edge. Neither spoke, but both understood that the memory of the herd roaring past them would never fade. By the time they finished and secured the buck for the trek back, the sun had begun to push through the fog. Rays of light revealed the vast plain below, stretching endlessly in muted colors. It should have been a view of triumph, but instead it carried the reminder of how fragile their safety truly was. When they finally descended, each step was taken with caution and respect. The ridge had shown them that even animals considered delicate and graceful could, when driven by fear, create a force strong enough to shake the very ground. The bruises on their bodies and the mud on their clothes would heal or wash away, but the lesson carved into their minds would remain forever.